Welcome to All Things Financial. This is Trey Peterson and Yelisey Coots, and we're going to talk today about now I have cash flow, now what? I feel like we spend so much time in our early days trying to figure out how to pay the bills, how to get ahead, but now you've advanced, you've got great income, you've got your savings that's growing, you're investing in the 401k. How do you multiply the money that you've worked so hard for? We're excited to share more in today's episode. Please join us. Welcome to All Things Financial, Trey Peterson and
Yelisey Coots,
where we help you retire once and retire well. In today's episode number 53, if this is your first episode, I would go back and start at episode 50 or 1. And today we're going to talk about 3 to 5 different things, depending on our timing, of how to maximize your retirement, 5 things to be aware of. And point number 1 is what we call buckets of money. Yelisey, tell us about how we teach buckets of money.
Well, I think it all started with how not to do it. So even when I was in college, we always talked about how older people generally gravitate towards having a very specific type of asset within their portfolio. They're looking for something that's going to generate interest, maybe dividends. And really the idea was if you can just have enough of a specific asset that generates enough income for you, you'll never have to sell any of those stocks or any of those bonds that you have because the income will be sufficient. And what we found is a lot of times it's not very sufficient. A lot of times you have emergencies that come up. You need to have an appropriate amount of cash, an appropriate amount of liquidity, emergency funds, if you will. Also, you're not generating the type of growth that you might need, especially if longevity, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the podcast, is something that you need to consider. And sometimes the conventional methods aren't always the best way of doing something. Just because people have done it like this for a very long time doesn't mean that's the best way to do it today. And there might be alternatives that we talk about. And it's not exclusively for everybody, but we're not afraid to explore some of the alternatives. Wouldn't you say?
I would. Yeah, I would say almost every week when we explain to people how we manage money and how their current group or advisor or 401k or 403b is managing it or the TSP, they'll say, why is my advisor doing it this way?
Right.
And so many times I often catch myself saying, because that's how they've always done it.
Right.
And so I think it's important for people to understand that the market's always changing, inflation is always changing, and the way that you invested the last 2, 3, 4 decades may not be the same way that you should invest today.
Yeah.
And so one of the questions I like to ask people is, are you sure that the way that you're invested today still fits your situation?
Yeah.
And I think oftentimes people don't know, right? Some of the times we're encouraging people to increase their risk because they've gotten too conservative. The next meeting, sometimes I find that they're so aggressive that I'm talking them down from the ledge. And so there are factors that we talk about, your need, your willingness, and your ability to take the risk. And so one of the things that we'll talk about today is what does that look like for you and your household? One of the things that we often find, and I don't know about for you, Yelisey, but in my household, my risk tolerance is very different than my spouse's.
Right. Yeah.
And we see that a lot. Oftentimes, one of them prefers more risk, higher return, and the other says, hey, I'm not so worried about big returns. I more just want to make sure that we're going to be okay. So how do you make sure that you invest in a way that as a household, that your investments are also effectively working together and that you're not creating inefficiencies because you have different risk tolerances?
It's going to sound like, we're obviously in the industry, of course you would say that, but that's where you need a third party. That's where you need somebody who can kind of step out from like the emotions that you have that maybe your spouse has where you don't match up on how you view risk. And you need to have a third party that can tell you, hey, this is the best way to get you from point A to point B. This is how we're going to make sure that we don't outlive the assets that we have. We're going to have an appropriate risk asset mix, if you will. And I think that really, challenging some of these assumptions that people have on a typical stocks, bonds portfolio, especially one that generates income, I think it's a great place to start because a lot of times there's things that people haven't considered. There's a danger in being overly aggressive, right? So if we're the person in the relationship who really wants to take on risk and just doesn't mind having a large amount of risk, there's a danger in having too much, right? Because if the stock market dips and it takes 7 years to recover and you're drawing heavily on your portfolio, that portfolio can be drained very quickly, right? There's something called sequence of returns, right? And sequence risk. On the other side, if you're too conservative, you're not keeping up with inflation, right? Inflation is going to erode your purchasing power. You're not going to have as much money to potentially afford retirement. So there's the other side of it.
I think about, 4 years ago, we met with a couple, some of the nicest people I've ever met. Not only were they nice, very generous people, but he had explained to me that, back in, was it maybe 99, 2000, 2001, when Enron went down, that he actually lost 100% of his portfolio because he had everything in there. And I'll never forget, he told me that here they were basically, at 50 years old, and he came home one day and they went from over $1 million to nothing overnight. Yeah. And he sat down with his family, his wife and his kids, and he said he was just shaking. And he told his kids, he said, your college fund is gone. And he told his wife, now because of what's happened, we're going to work until the day that we die. And what was interesting is that he decided that from that point on, his risk tolerance was zero. And so he went from, that 2000, 2001, over the next 20 years, he invested in the 401k, all of his funds, and then even the match in the money market account. So instead of averaging 8 or 10 or 12 or 15%, they averaged a little less than 4% for the last 20 years. And they managed to save $1 million, but it could have easily been, 3 to 4 million. So the other thing we want people to understand is, even if you've been through challenging things, understanding that some risk and diversified risk is very different than having all of your eggs in one basket.
Right.
What amount of interest do you need to make on your investments to make that money last, but also have it invested in a way that if we do have a big correction or a recession, you don't have that gut punch of, we're out all of the funds again.
If you were to touch on just, maybe what we refer to as the buckets of money or the colors of money, just a very broad general overview of what that looks like for us. Yeah,
I think, depending on how you think about money, you'll hear a lot of people say there's 3 pillars or 4 pillars of money. We call it buckets of money. They say 85% of people today are visual learners. And so we've created this beautiful visual picture showing 3 different buckets of money. And if you can picture this, on the left, we have a bucket that we call the yellow bucket, or your protected money. That's checking, savings, cash, Social Security, pensions. And what we like about that bucket of money is basically there's no risk. Some might argue that Social Security has some risk, some regulatory risk, which I guess they probably wouldn't be wrong. But that money is pretty safe. Even pensions, pretty safe. Obviously, something could happen to that company or that reinsurance group, but that's your safe money. In that bucket, typically we recommend in checking, savings, CDs, money market, that you should have 3 to 6 months of expenses. What does that look like? If your monthly expenses are $7,000 a month, we recommend that you have $21,000 to $42,000 sitting in checking and savings. Yeah. Now, some of our clients, even the wealthy ones, they've never had more than a couple thousand sitting in checking and savings because they know whatever's there, they're going to spend. Other clients of ours, they may have $100,000 to $300,000 sitting in checking, savings, and CDs because they sleep better at night knowing that they have access to that kind of money. My wife and I, like most of our couples that we serve, are very different. I could have 10 grand sitting in there and I'd be comfortable because I want to see my dollars go to work for me. When I see my money sitting in checking and savings, it doesn't give me peace. It gives me concern that I'm not making money on that money. Where for my wife, the more money that's in checking and savings, the more peace that she has, even though she's a stay-at-home mom. For her, that gives her peace. So one of the things that we talk about is have at least 3 to 6 months, invest the difference.
And I would say that probably in the last couple of years, we've seen that checking and saving emergency fund, we've seen the dollar amount probably increase because rates are actually competitive, right?
Yeah.
So,
they're actually earning some money on that money.
3 years ago when rates were at zero, basically, it was a little bit tougher to convince somebody to do that. Today, when you're getting 4 or 5%, over the last couple of years, it's been easier to, I think we've seen a larger increase in that bucket, if you will.
Yeah, certainly. And I think too, you have to know yourself and you have to calculate. What we do find is a lot of people don't calculate the cost of having money sitting. I mean, how often do we sit with a couple and they've got, again, 100 to a couple $100,000 sitting in a checking account, and had they just moved it over to a high yield savings, they could have been making 4% instead of 0.1%.
Exactly.
And so the other thing is just continuing to do things thoughtfully, having a partner, a business partner like us to make sure that you're maximizing your dollars can also be helpful. Yeah. Even oftentimes, there's a lot of times that we tell people, hey, if you need this money safe, you can get 4% sitting at your credit union, where maybe with us, some of the money market stuff, because of a fee, is a little bit less. We want your money earning the most, whether it's with us or not with us. So if we go to the next bucket, kind of a bucket in the middle, if you've got this picture, so 3 buckets. On the left, you've got your protected money. We call that the yellow bucket. In the middle, we've got a green bucket, and we call that what bucket?
Your income or safe bucket.
Yeah. So in that green bucket, basically, if you look at that, that would typically be bonds, money market, T-bills, annuities, anything really that has no risk or little risk.
And I would say traditionally bonds.
Yeah. Right. Historically, most people would say bonds.
Right.
And the goal of that money is low risk, but we need to stay ahead of inflation. So typically 3 to 6% a year is kind of that goal.
Yeah.
And then on the right, we have what we'd call the red bucket, which is the risk and reward. And in that bucket, that's where we have your stock, your equities, your mutual funds, your ETFs. And that's the bucket that we need to make you money. Now, depending on your risk, that bucket may be focused on that 5 to 8%, or maybe you're slightly more conservative and you want to make 8 to 12, but that's your growth bucket. In the good years, that's the money that's going to make you money. It's also going to make you smile when you pull up your mobile app and you see that, hey, the market's up and I'm up. The key is to have a balance. So if we think about over the last decade, you and I have met with probably thousands of people. We've worked with hundreds, but we've met thousands. And the average age of the person that we meet with typically is around that 60 to 70 years old. And when we think of the average portfolio, what would you say? We've got people that are more aggressive, people that are more conservative. But what would you say the average portfolio looks like as far as equities to bonds? And talk a little bit about how bonds historically have performed and what they've done the last 5 years, if you don't mind hitting on that.
Yeah. So I think most people are probably in a 60-40, right? I
agree.
I mean, anytime you read an article about a typical balanced portfolio, usually they're referencing a 60-40 portfolio and they're pulling historical numbers from that type of portfolio. I think that historically bonds have underperformed the expectations that we have. And you just look at the last 5 years, it actually isn't very encouraging at all. Like for most people, the response we have is, how is it that they're performing so poorly, yet they still represent 40% of all of my investable assets?
Yeah.
And that's the question where it's like, hey, is there an alternative? Should bonds still be a part of the portfolio? And I say absolutely yes. Bonds need to be a part of the portfolio. There's obviously different types of bonds. They're not all the same. We have intermediate, long-term bonds. There's a million different asset classes in terms of just bonds themselves. So they should remain in your portfolio, but should you also introduce other items like potentially a bond replacement? A lot of times we refer to annuities as bond replacements. And I think that that's a conversation worth having. Not to replace the entire 40%, but as an additional piece, just because of the underperformance we've seen over the last, so many years.
Well, if you look in 2022 alone, we had a really unique situation. Historically, when stocks and equities are down, bonds are flat or they're up. Everybody knows that. In 2022, when the S&P was down a little over 18%, on average, not only were our stocks and equities down, but our bonds were down on average 13 to 15%. What also is interesting is if you look at the last 5 years, when we see that they've lost over that period of time on average of 2 to 3% a year, that also doesn't even include the advisor fee or the 401k fee, which adds another 1 to 2% depending upon, your 401k plan or the advisor that you're with.
And that's the thing, like they're designed to stabilize your portfolio when stocks are down. But that was kind of the unusual thing that, almost every asset class was down substantially during that time.
And I think there's kind of two options. One is look at some alternatives or what we've seen people do, which, again, it's on the high risk side, is they've just replaced bonds with more equities. They've taken more risk. And it's worked on their behalf that the market's performed the last 5 years. However, one of the things that we continue to see when the market is up, the people that we meet with, oftentimes they come in and they go, Trey, Yelisey, I love growth. Give me growth.
Right.
And then when we have a correction, people come in and they go, I love safety. I love preservation. So one of the goals that we have and one of our jobs is to make sure in the good years our clients are making money, but making sure that in the recession years and the correction years, that they're also protected enough that it doesn't change their lifestyle in retirement.
We've talked about this a lot. A number of studies that show the numbers are really fascinating when it comes to the time that you have in the market versus timing the market, right? If you just missed like the 10 best days in a 30-year period in the market, how your returns could potentially be cut in half. Now, the numbers aren't exact, but it's something like that where it was just like, wow, like is that actually true?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it is, right? And if you could time the 10 best days or the 10 worst days, we'd be making a lot more money than we are today, all of us, right? So that's why one of the important things when it comes to investing, when it comes to putting together an investment strategy, particularly for retirement, about how the most important thing is consistency, making sure that you're spending the time in the market. And there's you and I were just looking at this right before. We looked to see what would happen if you decided to save $6,000 a year for 25 years in preparation for retirement.
Yeah.
At the age of 62, you'd roughly have $1 million that you would have saved for your retirement.
Yeah.
Now, if you take that a step further, imagine if instead of retiring at 62 with your $1 million, you decided to wait 5 more years. For 5 more years, you decided to contribute an additional $6,000 every year, and instead you retired at the age of 67.
Right.
How much money would you have?
Right.
And it's like almost 1.5 million.
Well, I think what people...
Why is that? It's just 5 more years.
Yeah, people underestimate the power of compounding interest.
Right.
Even yesterday, I had a couple call in, wonderful people, but she called in and she said, what does it look like if I retire a year earlier? And I said, well, actually, it impacts you more than you think. So instead of retiring at 65, she wanted to retire at 64.
Yeah.
And we'll just call her Samantha. I said, Samantha, my concern is if you work through age 65, based on your expenses, your assets, and your goals, your money's going to last until you're 91, which, by the way, when I say that, most people laugh and they go, well, I'm never going to live that long. What I do tell them is you might not, but it's important to have the option too.
Right.
Because we all want to make sure we have more money than we do life at the end. So what I said to her is I said, just by you not working till 65, if you retire this December at 64, your money ends up lasting, instead of till 91, it lasts until the end of 87. So it cut off like 3.5 years. And she said, how does 1 year of working impact my assets by 3.5 years? And I said, the reason is there's 3 things that happen. Number 1 is you stop your paycheck. So now you no longer have that money coming in. Number 2 is you still need that income. So now you're pulling it from the retirement account that now you're not contributing to, and you don't have a paycheck coming in. And 3, now you have to pay for healthcare, pre-Medicare for the next 12 months. So I said, between stopping your paycheck, not adding to your 401k, pulling from your 401k, and turning on health insurance, having to bridge that gap, that's how it impacts you by 3.5 years. And she was like, wow. She's like, I had no idea that it would impact me so significantly.
A lot of times when you share that example where it's like for 5 years, you're just contributing $6,000. How did you get an extra $480,000? Right? Well, it's because you're also not tapping into your initial investment. Those dollars that you're not touching, they're continuing to grow on your behalf. On top of that, you're not taking any distribution. So you're not depleting those dollars. Right. I mean, it's just like you said. So, it isn't necessarily the additional $6,000. It's all 3 of those things together, which allows you to have a substantial amount of additional income, additional resources in retirement.
You remember this about a year ago. We met a gentleman at one of the classes that we teach, very, very successful in his field. When we met with him in 2020, basically right before COVID, like right when COVID kind of started, like before, I want to say January of 2020, he got fearful like many of us, but he responded by taking $1 million out of his 401k and moving it to cash. Yeah. And we met with him in November, December of 2024. And even though thankfully he didn't take all of his money out of the market, $1 million out of the market was significant. Yeah. And then he didn't know when to put it back. So he did what we see so often. He never put it back. And what ended up happening is over that 4-year period, he averaged a 4% return sitting in the money market account, where had he left it in the S&P, he would have almost doubled that money over that 4-year period. It was like he lost 80 some percent. Yeah. And so one of the things I would say to people if you're taking notes is don't let fear, when you get close to or you start your retirement, cost you the reward of what you spent decades making the right decision for. So here he spent 35 plus years saving, being disciplined, putting money away, and that money would have almost doubled had he just stuck to the plan for 4 more years. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying that everybody should stay high risk, right? I do think that it's thoughtful and it's important to have some money in that green bucket to make sure that if we have a correction, that you've got a buffer for 3, 5, or 7 years that we can pull from some area, whether it's bonds, money market, T-bills, annuities, so that you can weather the storm. Unfortunately, he made a bad decision that cost him over $800,000 in a 4-year period.
And this is maybe not necessarily related to that, but if I remember correctly, this guy also experienced a huge increase in his annual income over the last 5 years.
He did.
Which actually led to probably more spending.
An increase in lifestyle.
An increase in lifestyle. So now he's extremely nervous because for him, retirement was mandatory.
Right.
I don't want to get into the specifics, but the career that he was in, it was mandatory retirement at a very specific age.
Right.
So now his lifestyle has expanded to match the income that he has.
Right.
But now his retirement savings aren't even close. They're not even close to being on track to be able to support and sustain that in retirement.
Well, I would say that a couple times a year, we'll run into a couple that maybe their income doubled or tripled in the last 5 to 10 years of retirement.
Which is, what a bummer that happens right before retirement.
And it's a great opportunity. We've also seen, we've got a wonderful new client. He went from making $130,000 a year in sales basically forever. And his company had a new software technology that came out. And 4 years before retirement, his income went up by 10x. He made like $1.5 million. Wow. And he and his wife were so impressive, they basically put it all away. And then they did that the next 3 years. I think he made $1 million. He made over $1 million every year the last 4 years. And they more than doubled their retirement money based on what he did in 4 years compared to the first 40.
Yeah.
So I love when a story ends well for a couple that is disciplined, they have good stewardship. But one of the things that we've seen, and we see it with young people too, the first year that you have more money than bills, you tend to spend that money on fun things. I think the world calls it FU money. We call it just fun money. But if you think about it, that's money that it's disposable income. And one of the things that we talk about is when you increase your income, continuing to live below your means and continuing to save and invest is really important.
When you think about all this, why is it so important to make sure that you're saving for retirement? I think the obvious things are, you're not going to make up what you're lacking in your 70s and your 80s, right? And the problem is most people are living longer, right? I think average life expectancy is like 75 for men, 80 for women, something like that. But one thing that people don't consider is that's if you look at the entire population.
Right.
Right. That's including like the infant mortality numbers. That's including drug overdoses. That's including every segment of the population. What we found is the numbers that probably are more appropriate to use are for those that have attained the age of 65.
Right.
And that's where I think for us, we're meeting people that are in that category. The average age of someone who, if they attain the age of 65, what's the likelihood that they're going to make it to age 90?
So if you make it to age 65, 1 in 3 people are going to make it to age 90. Really significant.
Yeah.
1 in 7 are going to make it to age 97.
Yeah.
So what's interesting about that too is I would say that 90% of the time that we do a retirement analysis for people, they've only looked at if everything goes right.
Or they're looking at average life expectancy. I can't tell you how many times I'm preparing a Social Security report and it asks you to make a projection. Now, nobody has a crystal ball, but it's kind of a weird conversation. How long do you think I'm going to live? And most of the time people say late 70s, early 80s. And it's like, hey, if you're already 65, 1 in 3 are going to make it to age 90, right? I mean, I think most people aren't prepared for that. And it's a lot of times the response I get, who would want to live that long?
Me, if I'm healthy.
Right, if you're healthy, of course.
I think what's important is most people that we meet with, it's kind of interesting. They've never done a spend down plan and a retirement analysis to look to see how long is the money going to last. And most people, if they do it, they go, well, I haven't retired yet. And I'm like, you should be doing this 7 to 10 years before retirement so that you can shift things. The other thing that people don't think about is what happens if one of you gets let go of your job 5 years early, 3 years early? What happens if one of you has health challenges and can't work and now you got to go on Social Security disability and that couple no longer has dual income, but they have a single income?
Yep.
What happens if one of you passes away and now instead of 2 Social Security benefit checks, you only have 1? And the other thing that people don't realize is if you lose your spouse, your expenses don't get cut in half. In fact, we have one client, she's a widow, she's hilarious. She said, when my husband died, I thought my expenses would get cut in half. And the only thing that changed is we no longer spent $400 a month on beer.
Right. Well, the other thing that
they
changes,
lost $2,000 from her Social Security check. She got his because his was larger. But her Social Security check of $2,000 a month was gone. $400 of beer was less, maybe less groceries, but maybe her expenses dropped $1,000, but her income dropped by $2,000. So not a recipe for success.
Yeah. So what you're saying is if you lose a spouse, your expenses stay about the same. You probably experience a reduction in your income. And now you're no longer in the broader married filing jointly tax brackets. You're in the single tax brackets.
So likely
now,
you pay more taxes on less
on less
income
income.
with the same expenses.
That's obviously a scenario you need to avoid. Now, I know everyone's situation is different. Not everybody, when they lose a spouse, does their income get cut in half, right?
For sure.
Sometimes there's a huge difference between the benefits. Sometimes you elect to have spousal continuation on your pension. Sometimes you don't, right? It really depends on what your asset mix looks like. But that's a scenario that is easy to avoid with a little bit of planning.
Yeah,
I would say.
certainly. So what I want to say is, if you've never had a retirement plan put together for you, looking at the best case and worst case scenarios, what happens if somebody needs long-term care? Do we have long-term care insurance, or are we self-funding? What happens if one of us has a pension and now my spouse only gets half of that, or maybe they get none of it because I took it where I get it at 100%.
Yeah.
Do we have life insurance to make up for the fact that now your corporation kept that chunk of money and your spouse wasn't on the continuation plan?
Yeah.
Or what does it look like if they only receive a portion of it? And so one of the things that I would just say is, as you're planning for retirement, even though people don't like talking about these things, one of my favorite things about what we do is when I end an analysis appointment or I end a solution, and one of them or both of them will look at me and they'll say, we've never walked through this before. And after seeing all the different iterations of what could happen,
Right.
we have more financial peace than we've ever had. And I hear it so often, and that's part of why I love what we do.
One thing I'll say is, on a positive note, I don't know that we've experienced it exactly what the numbers suggest, where your expenses go down at certain age intervals. Mm-hmm. I think for us, we find that expenses tend to go up a little bit, probably in your early 60s, all the way until your mid 70s. And I think for us, that's where we experience, at least with our clients, a significant drop off in monthly or annual spending. Yep. If you look at averages all over the country, they tend to suggest that spending goes down earlier at the age of 65. That's when spending experiences a large decrease. So whether it's at 65 or a little bit later in your early 70s, you do experience a decrease. And for us, we call that, initially in retirement, we call it the go-go years, the slow-go years, and then eventually the no-go years. Probably in your 80s, you're not traveling as much. Maybe you're skipping out on a few of the grandkids' softball games and things like that. But things start to slow down a little bit for you, and you can expect your expenses to slow down too. But there's one thing that doesn't slow down: healthcare-related expenses.
Right.
So every time we teach a class on Social Security, we reference this article. It's from 2019, but a guy named Jason Fitchner, he was the former chief economist at Social Security, and he was one of the biggest contributors to this article. But he talked about making sure that whenever you make a filing decision on Social Security, this article, by the way, found only 4% of people filed at the most optimal time.
Right. 96% take it at the wrong time.
Nobody, hindsight's 20/20, but I think on average they found most households were leaving $111,000 on average,
Wow.
leaving it on the table based on their filing decision, based on when and how they chose to file for Social Security. But one of the things that he talked about is making sure that whatever your decision is, whether it's related to your Social Security, whether it's related to your pension, whether it's related to your investable assets that you have, that you do it with this thought in mind, making sure you have enough income and enough resources to last you for the rest of your retirement, however long that might be. And I think that, life expectancy is a big part of that. Of course, expenses go down. But one additional thing that's noted there is the cost of all goods and services and how much it's increased over the last 25 years compared to healthcare related expenses.
Yeah.
We don't want to, spend a lot of time on something that, most people probably don't enjoy, the topic of healthcare related expenses, but it's a significant expense in retirement and one that we have to be prepared for.
We talk a lot about CPI-U versus CPI-E and how that significantly impacts our clients and people in and nearing retirement. Would you just take a minute, talk a little bit about the difference between CPI-E and CPI-U? Yeah,
so not to bore everybody, but just very quickly, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that's who tracks all this. So every single month, they're tracking the cost of goods and services throughout our economy. I think it's like 80,000 goods and services are tracked. So they're looking to see, how are these specific items, how are they going up in cost? Are they going down in cost? What are the various influences that force these items to go up and down? And we're talking like milk, cheese, eggs, all the various groceries, doctor's appointments, cable bills. I mean, everything you can think of in our economy. And then we have a weighting that's assigned to each item. And we call that our basket of goods and services. And that's supposed to represent how we as Americans spend our money. Well, there's one basket of goods and services called the CPI-U. And U stands for urban consumers, right? And that's supposed to represent like 93% of the population. And then there's a number called CPI-E. CPI-E was just like something that they introduced. They thought it was a good idea. Why don't we have something that represents the spending habits of older Americans, like those over the age of 62? Not calling anybody old, but that's what CPIE.
They're older.
Because just like you might imagine, overall the categories that the basket of goods represents, older Americans tend to spend their money a little bit differently. And there's one category where they spend more money on, unfortunately. Healthcare related expenses.
Right. And not by choice.
Not by choice, right? Of course not. So one of the things that, that there's been an argument over this is, well, why wouldn't Social Security be adjusted by CPIE?
Right.
Instead of CPI? Actually, a whole new category, not to introduce it. Social Security is adjusted by something called CPIW, which supposedly represents about 33% of the population.
What does the W stand for?
Wage and clerical workers.
Okay.
So, unfortunately, nobody uses CPIE for anything meaningful other than it's out there. We can compare it. And there is a big case to be made for, hey, why wouldn't we have Social Security be adjusted by what seniors actually spend money on? Why wouldn't it coincide with that? So, to make a long story short, the biggest thing is making sure that you're making wise decisions that take inflation into account, making sure that you're actually considering that whoever is helping you with your planning. The last thing I'll say on Social Security is, the cost of living adjustment, it's announced every October. Every October, the cost of living adjustment is announced. By the following January, your benefits experience an increase. Your Social Security benefit. Is the increase enough? That's a separate conversation. That's a debate for a different day. But one of the important things to note is that only happens if you've made it to the age of 62. Like you and I aren't experiencing a cost of living adjustment. We're simply paying into the system. Our highest 35 years are being calculated. Eventually we get a benefit. But the cost of living adjustment happens from the age of 62 for the rest of your life. So imagine if you're helping somebody plan and you're looking at somebody who has a $500 Social Security benefit compared to somebody who has a $4,000 Social Security benefit.
Yeah.
Every year, the $500 person doesn't care about the cost of living adjustment. It's not going to meaningfully impact their life.
Right.
But if you have a $4,000 benefit, you're getting more dollars per adjustment every single year. And if you look at that over a 20-year period, that continues to compound.
Right.
So it's not going to make or break your decision on when and how to file, but just one of those things to consider in the planning process that we really take an interest in, especially as we're building out plans for folks.
Yeah. Let's end with this. One of the big areas that seems simple that we meet a lot of the families that we serve is through our Social Security classes. One of the things that we see a lot of people do is they're so slow and delayed and thoughtful about when they touch the 401k, the IRA, the SEP account, the brokerage account, the Roth account, and they try to delay it. They try to live off checking savings, which oftentimes can be a good plan, but not for everyone. But then they're not really thoughtful about Social Security. It's like, hey, Social Security is synonymous with retirement in their head. So I'm about to retire, so I better turn that on. One of the things that I would say is if you can be strategic with your Social Security, we meet a lot of people where that one lever, just pulling that one lever at the right time, can make their money last an extra 3, 5, or more years. What is an example or what is something regarding Social Security that those that are listening that could impact them that you've seen in your 10 years now teaching financial classes and serving all the people that we serve?
Every dollar is not created equal. Social Security has a different set of rules that determines how every dollar from Social Security is taxed.
It's really favored.
It's favored, right? For Social Security, it's possible to have a tax-free dollar from Social Security. Whereas if you have income from your job, if you have income from a pension, your retirement savings, really every source of income you have, unless it's coming from like a life insurance policy, your Roth IRA, or your checking and savings, which has already been taxed, every dollar is 100% taxable.
Yeah.
With Social Security, everybody is on a range between 0 and 85%.
Right.
In other words, your Social Security might be completely tax-free or up to 85% of it can become taxable income. And that's where the advantage comes in. It might not seem like it's that great of an advantage when 85 cents on the dollar can be taxable, but it's still an advantage compared to your other sources of income. Every additional dollar you receive from Social Security is a dollar you don't have to pull from your IRA to meet the same standard of living.
Yeah.
So if you don't have to pull it from your IRA, you're saving money on your federal income taxes.
Yeah.
And how do you get additional dollars from Social Security? Well, you could pay more into the system, hope that you generate a larger benefit, or the most obvious answer for most people is maybe consider delaying on your Social Security benefits.
Yeah, well said.
Most people take it at the earliest possible time, and a very small number of people wait until the age of 70. I don't think everybody should wait until 70, but consider delaying. And really the biggest thing I would say is sit down with somebody who can help you coordinate your Social Security with every other source of income you have to find out the best strategy for you.
Well, I think the other big thing is if you've never had a Social Security strategy put together for you, that's one of the things that we do for people complimentary, right? So if you've never had a strategy on when and how to take it, how to maximize it, people can reach out to us. We've got a great phone number, 612-286-0000. 0580 or our website or one of our emails, Trey and or Yelisey at atfwealth.com. Anything else you want to say as we wrap up helping people maximize their retirement today?
I think that's it. I think we got it.
All right. We want to help you retire once and retire well. Thank you for joining us for episode number 53, season 2. We hope you have a great day. Join us for our next one.
Advisory services are offered through CG Advisory Services, LLC, a registered investment advisor, and through Guardian Wealth Strategies, LLC, a registered investment advisor. CG Advisory Services, LLC, and Guardian Wealth Strategies, LLC, are separate and unaffiliated entities. The topics discussed on this podcast are for educational purposes only and are not intended to be investment advice or recommendations. Listeners should consult with their own financial professionals before making any investment decisions.